सो हेलो बच्चा पार्टी। क्या हाल चाल है आप सभी। तो स्वागत करते हैं आपका अपना पहला सा चैनल एसक्यूएल जे पे। और आज से हम स्टार्ट करने वाले हैं एनसीईआरटी लाइन बाय लाइन, रीडिंग ऑफ एनसीईआरटी लाइन बाय लाइन। चलो, तो आज का पहला चैप्टर अपन स्टार्ट करते हैं, ब्रीदिंग एंड एक्सचेंज ऑफ गैसेस। सही। सो इंट्रोडक्शन देखें तो एज यू have lead earlier, oxygen O2 is utilized by the organisms to indirectly break down simple molecules like glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, etc. to derive energy to perform various activities. Carbon dioxide CO2, which is harmful, is also released during the above catabolic reaction. It is therefore evident that O2 has to be continuously provided to the cells and CO2 produced by the cells have to be released out. This process of exchange of O2 from the atmosphere with the CO2 produced by the cells is called as breathing, commonly known as a respiration. Place your hands on your chest. You can feel the chest moving up and down. You know that it is due to a breathing. How do we breathe? The respiratory organs and mechanism of breathing are described in the following section of this chapter. 14.1 Mechanism of breathing. Respiratory organs. Mechanism of breathing vary among different groups of animals depending mainly on their habitats and level of organizations. Lower invertebrates like sponges, coelacanths, flatworms, etc. exchange O2 with CO2 by simple diffusion over their entire body surface. Earthworms use their moist cuticle, and insects have a network of tubes, that is, trachea tubes, to transport atmospheric air within their body. Special vascularized structure called gills, that is a branchial respiration, are used by most of the aquatic arthropods and molluscs, whereas vascularized bags called lungs, that is pulmonary respiration, are used by the terrestrial forms for the exchange of gases. Among vertebrates, fishes use gills, whereas amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals respire through lungs. Amphibians like frog can respire through their moist skin, that is cutaneous respiration also. 14.1.1 Human respiratory system. We have a pair of external nostrils opening out above the upper lips. It leads to a nasal chamber through the nasal passage. The nasal chamber opens into the pharynx, a portion of which is the common passage for food and air. The pharynx opens through the larynx lesion into the trachea. Larynx is a cartilaginous box which helps in a sound production and hence called sound box. During swallowing, glottis can be covered by a thin elastic cartilaginous flap called epiglottis to prevent the entry of food into larynx. Trachea is a straight tube extended up to a mid-thoracic cavity which divides at the level of a fifth thoracic vertebra into right and left primary bronchi. Each bronchi undergo repeated divisions to form the secondary and tertiary bronchi and bronchioles, ending up in a very thin terminal bronchioles. The tracheae, primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi and initial bronchioles are supported by an incomplete cartilaginous link. Each terminal bronchiole gives rise to a number of a very thin irregular walled and vascularized bags-like structure called alveoli. The branching network of a bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli comprise the lungs. We have two lungs which are covered by a double layered pleura with pleural fluid between them. It reduces friction on the lung surface. The outer pleural membrane is in a close contact with the thoracic lining, whereas the inner pleural membrane is in the contact with the lung surface. Sorry. The part starting with the external nostrils up to a terminal bronchioles constitute the conducting part, whereas the alveoli and their ducts form the respiratory or exchange part of the respiratory system. The conducting part transports the atmospheric air to the alveoli, clears it from the foreign particles, humidified, and also brings the air to the body temperature. Exchange part is the site of actual diffusion of O2 and CO2 between blood and atmospheric air. The lungs are situated in the thoracic chamber, which is anatomically an airtight chamber. The thoracic chamber is formed dorsally by the vertebral column, ventrally by the sternum, laterally by the lips, and on lower side by the dome-shaped diaphragm. The atmospheric anatomical setup of the lungs in a thorax is such that any change in a volume of the thoracic cavity will be reflected in the lungs, that is pulmonary cavity. Such an arrangement is essential for breathing as we cannot directly alter the pulmonary volume. Now, respiration involves the following steps. First, breathing or pulmonary ventilation, by which atmospheric air is drawn in and CO2-rich alveolar air is released out. Second, diffusion of gases, that is O2 and CO2, across the alveolar membrane. Third, transport of gases by blood. Fourth, diffusion of O2 and CO2 between blood and tissues. Fifth, utilization of O2 by the cells for catabolic reaction and resultant release of CO2, that is cellular respiration, as dealt in chapter 12. 14.2 Mechanism of breathing. Breathing involves two stages, that is inspiration, during which atmospheric air is drawn in, and expiration, by which the alveolar air is released out. The movement of air into and out of the lungs is carried out by creating pressure gradient between the lungs and atmosphere. Inspiration can occur if the pressure within the lungs, that is intrapulmonary pressure, is less than the atmospheric pressure. That is, there is a negative pressure in the lungs with respect to atmospheric pressure. Similarly, expiration takes place when the intrapulmonary pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure. The diaphragm and the specialized set of muscle, that is external and internal intercostals between the lips, help in the generation of such gradients. Inspiration is initiated by the contraction of a diaphragm, which increases the volume of a thoracic chamber in the anterior-posterior axis. The contraction of external internal intercostal muscles lifts up the lips and sternum, causing an increase in the volume of the thoracic chamber in dorsoventral axis. The overall increase in the thoracic volume causes a similar increase in a pulmonary volume. An increase in the pulmonary volume decreases the intrapulmonary pressure to less than the atmospheric pressure, which forces the air from outside to move into the lungs, that is inspiration. Relaxation of a diaphragm and intercostal muscles returns the diaphragm and sternum to the normal position and reduce the thoracic volume and thereby the pulmonary volume. This leads to increase in intrapulmonary pressure to slightly above the atmospheric pressure, causing exclusion of air from the lungs. That is expiration. We have the ability to increase the strength of inspiration and expiration with the help of additional muscle in the abdomen. On an average, a healthy human breathes 12 to 16 times per minute. The volume of air involved in a breathing movement can be estimated by the using of a spirometer, which leads in a clinical assessment of pulmonary functions. 14.2.1 Respiratory volumes and capacities. Tidal volume (TV) volume of air inspired or expired during a normal respiration. It is approx 500 ml. That is a healthy uh, that is a healthy man can inspire or expire approximately 6,000 to 8,000 ml of air per minute. Inspiratory leisure volume (IRV). A person can inspire by a forcible inspiration. This averages 2,500 ml to 3,000 ml. Expiratory leisure volume. A person can expire by a forcible expiration. This averages 1,000 to 1,100 ml. Residual volume (RV) volume of air remaining in the lungs even after a forcible expiration. This average 1100 to 1200 ml. By adding up a few respiratory volumes described above, one can derive various pulmonary capacities, which can be used in a clinical diagnosis. Inspiratory capacity (IC). Total volume of air a person can inspire after a normal expiration. This includes a tidal volume and inspiratory leisure volume (TV plus IRV). Expiratory capacity (EC). Total volume of air a person can expire after a normal inspiration. This includes tidal volume and expiratory leisure volume (TV plus ERV). Functional residual capacity (FRC). Volume of air that will remain in the lungs after the normal expiration. This includes ERV plus RV. Vital capacity (VC). The maximum volume of air a person can breathe in after a forcible expiration. This includes ERV, TV, and IRV, or the maximum volume of air a person can breathe out after a forced inspiration. Total lung capacity (TLC). Total volume of air accommodated in the lungs at the end of a forced inspiration. This includes RV, ERV, TV, and IRV, or vital capacity plus residual volume. 14.3 Exchange of gases. Alveoli are the primary site of gases. Alveoli are the primary site of exchange of gases. Exchange of gases also occur between blood and tissue. O2 and CO2 are exchanged in this site by a simple diffusion, mainly based on a pressure concentration gradient. Solubility of gases as well as the thickness of the membranes involved in the diffusion are also some important factors that can affect the rate of diffusion. Pressure contributed by an individual gas in a mixture of gases is called partial pressure and is represented as PO2 for oxygen and PCO2 for carbon dioxide. Partial pressure of these two gases in the atmospheric air and the two sites of diffusion are given in table 14.1 and in the figure 14.3. The data given in the table clearly indicates a concentration gradient for oxygen from alveoli to blood and blood to tissue. Similarly, a gradient is present for O2 in the opposite direction, that is from tissue to blood and blood to alveoli. As the solubility of the CO2 is 20 to 25 times higher than that of O2, the amount of CO2 that can diffuse through the diffusion membrane per unit difference in partial pressure is much higher compared to the O2. The diffusion membrane is made up of three major layers, namely a thin squamous epithelium of alveoli, the endothelium of alveolar capillaries, and basement substance that is composed of a thin basement substance basement membrane supporting the squamous epithelium and the basement membrane surrounding a single layer endothelial cells of capillaries. In between them, however, its total thickness is much less than a millimeter. Therefore, all the factors in our body are favorable for diffusion of O2 from alveoli to tissue and that of CO2 from tissue to alveoli. 14.4 Transport of gases. Blood is a medium of transported for O2 and CO2. About 92-97% of O2 is transported by RBC in the blood. The remaining 3% of O2 is carried in a dissolved state through the plasma. Nearly 20 to 25% of CO2 is transported by RBC, whereas 70% of it is carried as bicarbonate. About 7% of CO2 is carried in a dissolved state through plasma. 14.4.1 Transport of oxygen. Hemoglobin is a lead-colored iron-containing pigment present in the RBCs. O2 can bind with hemoglobin in a reversible manner to form oxyhemoglobin. Each hemoglobin molecule can carry a maximum of 4 molecules of O2. Binding of oxygen with hemoglobin is primarily related to partial pressure of O2, partial pressure of CO2, hydrogen ion concentration, and temperature are the other factors which can interfere with this binding. A sigmoid curve is obtained when a percentage saturation of hemoglobin with O2 is plotted against the PO2. This curve is called oxygen dissociation curve and is highly useful in the studying the effect of factors like PCO2, H plus concentration, etc. on binding of O2 with hemoglobin. In the alveoli where the PO2 is high, low PCO2, lesser H plus concentration and lower the temperature, the factors are favorable for the formation of oxyhemoglobin. Whereas in the tissue, where a low PO2, high PCO2, high H plus concentration and higher temperature exists, the conditions are favorable for dissociation of oxygen from oxyhemoglobin. This clearly indicates that O2 gets bound to hemoglobin in the lung surface and gets dissociated at the tissue. Every 100 ml of oxygenated blood can deliver around 5 ml of O2 to the tissue under a normal physiological condition. 14.4.2 Transport of carbon dioxide. CO2 is carried by hemoglobin as a carbaminohemoglobin about 20 to 25%. This binding is related to partial pressure of CO2. CO2 is a major factor could affect the which could affect this binding when PCO2 is high when and PO2 is low as in the tissue. A more binding of carbon dioxide occurs whereas when the PCO2 is low and PO2 is high as in the alveoli, dissociation of CO2 from carbaminohemoglobin takes place, that is CO2 which is bound to hemoglobin from the tissue is delivered at alveoli. RBCs contain a very high concentration of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase and minute quantities of same is present in the plasma too. This enzyme facilitates the following reaction in both directions. CO2 plus H2 gives H2CO3 in the presence of carbonic anhydrase and vice versa, and H2CO3 gives HCO3 minus plus H plus ion in the presence of carbonic anhydrase and vice versa. At the tissue site where partial pressure of CO2 is high due to catabolism, CO2 diffuses into blood, that is RBCs and plasma, and forms HCO3 minus and H plus. At the alveolar site where PCO2 is low, the reaction proceeds in the opposite direction, leading to the formation of CO2 and H2O. Thus, CO2 trapped as bicarbonate at the tissue level and transported to the alveoli is released out as CO2. Every 100 ml of a deoxygenated blood delivers approximately 4 ml of CO2 to the alveoli. Sorry. 14.5 Regulation of respiration. Human beings have a significant ability to maintain and modulate the respiratory rhythm to suit the demands of the body tissues. This is done by a neural system, a specialized center present in the medulla region of the brain called respiratory rhythm center is primarily responsible for this regulation. Another center present in the pons region of the brain called a pneumotoxic center can modulate the functions of the respiratory rhythm center. Neural signals from this center can reduce the duration of inspiration and thereby alter the respiratory rate. A chemosensitive area is situated adjacent to the rhythm center which is highly sensitive to CO2 and hydrogen ions. Increase in these substances can activate this center which in turn can signal the rhythm center to make the necessary adjustment in the respiratory process by which these substances can be eliminated. Receptors associated with a aortic arc and the carotid artery also can recognize changes in CO2 and H plus concentration and send necessary signals to the rhythm center for remedial actions. The role of oxygen in the regulation of respiratory rhythm is quite insignificant. 14.6 That is disorders of a respiratory system. First, asthma. Asthma is a difficulty in breathing causing wheezing due to inflammation of a bronchi and bronchioles. Sorry. Then emphysema. Emphysema is a chronic disorder in which alveolar walls are damaged due to which respiratory surface is decreased. One of the major causes this is cigarette smoking. Then third is occupational respiratory disorders, that is in certain industries, especially those involving gliding or stone breaking, so much dust is produced that the defense mechanism of the body cannot fully cope with the situation. Long exposure can give rise to inflammation leading to fibrosis, that is proliferation of fibrous tissue, and thus causing serious lung damage. Workers in such industries should wear protective masks. Summary. Cells utilize oxygen for metabolic and produce energy along with substances like carbon dioxide which is harmful. Animals have evolved different mechanisms for the transport of oxygen to cells and for the removal of carbon dioxide from there. We have a well-developed respiratory system comprising two lungs and associated air passage to perform this function. The first step is in a the first step in respiration is a breathing by which atmospheric air is taken in, that is inspiration, and alveolar air is released out, that is expiration. Exchange of O2 and CO2 between deoxygenated blood and alveoli, transport of these gases throughout the body by blood. Exchange of O2 and CO2 between oxygenated blood and tissue and utilization of O2 by the cells. That is cellular respiration. All the other steps are inward. Inspiration and expiration are carried out by the creating pressure gradient between the atmosphere and the alveoli with the help of specialized muscles, intercostals and diaphragm. Volume of air involved in these activities can be estimated with the help of spirometer and are clinical significance. Exchange of O2 and CO2 at alveoli and tissue occur by diffusion. Rate of diffusion is dependent on the partial pressure gradients of O2, that is PO2, and CO2, that is PCO2, their solubility as well as their thickness of the diffusion surface. These factors in our body facilitates diffusion of O2 from the alveoli to the oxygenated blood as well as from oxygenated blood to the tissue. The factors are favorable for the diffusion of CO2 in the opposite direction, that is from tissue to alveoli. Oxygen is transported mainly as oxyhemoglobin in the alveoli where PO2 is higher. O2 gets bound to the hemoglobin which is easily dissociated at the tissues where PO2 is low and PCO2 is high. Its plus concentration are also high. Nearly 70% of carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate, that is in the form of HCO3 minus with the help of enzyme carbonic anhydrase. 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide is carried out by hemoglobin as carb-aminohemoglobin in the tissue where PCO2 is high. It gets bound to blood, whereas in the alveoli where PCO2 is low, PO2 is high. It gets removed from the blood. Respiratory rhythm center is maintained by the respiratory center in the medulla region of the brain, pneumotoxic center in the pons region of the brain, and the chemosensitive area in the medulla can alter the respiratory mechanism. So thank you so much. Here is breathing and exchange of gases is completed.